Yeah. So welcome to my talk. Thanks for holding out that long. This is the last talk of the session. I am going to talk about CNTK. You have seen that word a couple of times in the previous presentations. It's also called the Microsoft Cognitive Toolkit. So my name is Frank Seide. I am a principal researcher by training on speech recognition, but somehow slid into this role of being the architect of CNTK, the Cognitive Toolkit. And what I'm going to present today is, collaboration with many, many different people. You can see I also lived in China for a while. So deep learning is really, has profoundly affected how Microsoft goes about all these sort of cognitive kind of tasks, such as speech recognition, machine translation, image recognition, and it's really in every single product in that direction. It's really also making its way into pretty much every product in Microsoft. And at the moment it's shipping, for example, in Microsoft Cognitive Services, Skype Translator, Cortana, Bing, HoloLens, and many research projects. So for example, we have a whole suite of cognitive services, and many of them are built today with CNTK. So if you look at the impact of deep learning, it really started somewhere around 2010. That's when more and more technologies adopted deep learning. For example, this is the image recognition accuracy. In about 2010, the baseline was about 28%. And then it really came down very much. This is where AlexNet, that was the first deep network in this area, kicked in. And in the end, over that is 5 years, 6 years, we brought it down by nearly an order of magnitude. This specific model is the residual network model that my colleagues at MSI Asia in Beijing developed. So it's a factor of 10, nearly a factor of 10 accuracy improvement. And then once you do these things, you can do fun stuff. We have a cognitive service that actually allows you to guess the age and also give you actually captions of the scene. It says it's a group of young children sitting next to a child and they seem so happy. I think this is a pretty good, pretty accurate description. You can also do more serious things with that. For example, Uber recently announced that they're using the Microsoft Face API to do face verification for drivers for security purposes. Another thing, and that's close to my heart, being a speech researcher, is the progress in speech recognition. So specifically, if you look at this curve, it shows the speech recognition error rate on a very difficult task, which is free-form conversations between people. It's called the switchboard task, telephone calls, and transcribing that. And you can see how the error rate has come down over many years. This was actually sponsored by the American government. So now it's up to you to guess why the American government is interested in transcribing telephone calls. You can see that at that point it kind of plateaued. It didn't get better. We were hanging at maybe 24% word error rate. And then once we introduced deep learning into the mix, it immediately went down to 14%. And it turns out we recently started another project where we really tried to put everything together that we had learned in the couple of years since then, and we brought it down much further to 5.8 at this moment. And it turns out that's actually better than professional human transcription. So this is the first time that actually speech recognition of free-form conversation has been better than professional human transcribers. That was about half a year ago. And this is all built with CNTK. So let me see. I think I would probably skip to this one here. So one of the things you can do with this, once you have really good speech recognition accuracy, you can build very interesting applications out of that. One example is machine translation. So I'm going to show you just a quick demo video. I will go to some actual meat later on, but let's just, as an introduction.
Speak your language.
Die ich dir gestern geschickt habe.
But I wanted to talk to you about the email that I sent you yesterday.
Brauchst du noch irgendwelche Änderungen?
Do you need any changes?
There was one thing though. Could you change the green to a lighter shade?
Könnten Sie das Grün durch einen helleren Farbton ändern?
Ja, wir können das Grün viel heller machen.
Yes, we can make the green much brighter.
Ich sende dir heute Abend eine neue Datei.
I'm sending you a new file tonight.
So this is Skype Translator as it's shipping. If you have Skype Translator on your PC, very likely you have that already installed. And that was only possible because of the great progress that deep learning has allowed us to make. Okay, so what I would like to do today is first, because I wasn't quite sure what the mix of the audience is, I thought I will start with sort of a more basic sort of crash course on deep neural networks. Probably if it's not for every one of you, it's probably going to take about 5 minutes. Then I will introduce the Microsoft Cognitive Toolkit, CNTK. Then talk about how we're defining networks in CNTK. And then talk about how we actually get very good performance in executing these networks. So let's start with a sort of a crash course. I call it Deep Neural Networks in a single slide. Right? So let's start with an actual biological neuron. How do those things work? Well, they have inputs called dendrites, and then they have outputs called axons. And what happens everywhere where these inputs connect, there are synapses. So these synapses, these connections impose a weight of the strength of the signal. And then what the cell internally does, it essentially kind of sums up the weighted inputs. Okay? And then the result, because we're dealing with biology, sort of saturates. And the typical function for saturation is a sigmoid function that we're using here. So you can write it in this way, right? Now, the next important thing is that neurons never work alone. They always operate as collections. So mathematically, you can really think of them as vectors, the vectors of neurons. So this sort of correlation operation becomes a matrix product. That's why you see matrix products all over the place, right, in neural network formulas. But really, this matrix product should be read as you have a matrix where every row is a pattern that the input gets correlated with. And the corresponding output has a high value if they match, and a low value if they don't match. And for example, if you do this for maybe 2,000 neurons, now you get a 2,000 dimensional representation of which of these input patterns match and which of them don't match. Now the next thing is then that we're talking about deep models, right? So deep models means they're arranged in layers. So if we take a model like the one we just looked at, and what we do is we take the output of that and make it the input of the next layer. And what that means is that you have this cascade of networks where at every layer this representation becomes more and more abstract. I will show you an example later. Next, this connectivity pattern, what the neurons actually look at, can be local. So you have these so-called spatial receptive fields. And this is what's commonly called, what you commonly do in vision processing. And lastly, they can form feedback loops. Okay? So this is called CNN, this is RNN, right? So, well, this is neural networks in a single slide. It's deep, neural networks. They can be fully connected, convolutional, or recurrent. Okay? Now, I would like to talk about each of these three types just a little bit more. So let's talk about the fully connected one. So I've drawn a fully connected network here. So you can see what happens. It takes an input, multiplies it with a matrix. That's just a correlation along many different dimensions. We typically add a bias and then apply this saturation function. The output then is the input for the next layer, and so on. At the very top, you have a slightly different nonlinearity. And in this case, let's apply that to speech. So this is a spectrogram, and we're going to look at a window of speech. So what you would see in these weight matrices is, well, this weight matrix has 2,000 entries. Now I can take these 2,000 entries and plot them in the same shape as those. This is not 2,000, I took a subsection, and you can see what it actually learns to discover. It looks for example, what do we have here? What is this? This is some sort of form and structure where some pattern slides downwards over time. It starts at a higher point and it goes down. Then if you look at something like this is in time, it's sort of a sharp onset of a broad noise pattern or something like that. So you can see that in this speech application, this thing looks for different things that you might observe in a spectrogram for speech. And exactly the same thing happens in vision as well. You actually do find very, very similar patterns even in image recognition networks. So the next layer then basically has these sort of indicators that says, okay, I found something that looks like maybe broadband, low energy. And this guy maybe says, okay, something has a peak somewhere at a very specific frequency, and so on. And so on. It gets more and more abstract. So the next is a convolutional neural network. Convolutional neural network, now really think of it as applying a fully connected network, but to a very small patch of image, and then using the same network on all the different patches, all the different pixel positions. And what those things learn, if you look at some intermediate layer, for example, look at that neuron, it learns areas that are red. So if you look here, it found this is a strongly red area. Here, strawberry. So that's not very hard to do, right? But another neuron turns out learns where faces are. Right? So you see this, it's highly activated where at the spatial positions where the faces are. And there's another one, this one learns letters, to look for letters. Right? Everywhere we have letters, it has high activations. Again, these, of course, these patterns are automatically learned. Now the last class, again, is the recurrent network, and the important thing is that it also repeatedly applies a fully connected network, but over time. And its input is always the output of the previous time step. Now, if you're, many of you are computer scientists, so it turns out that if you're familiar with functional programming languages, these map very nicely on patterns that exist in functional programming languages. If you're a signal processing person like me originally, you will find it matches certain types of filters. And so there's a lot of connection to what we already know from other sciences. And the most interesting applications, of course, are combinations. So for example, in translation, you encode a sentence and decode it in a different language. In caption generation, you encode an image and decode it in a different language, and so on. Okay, so now how do we train those kind of networks? Well, there are three different ways of training it. One is called supervised learning. Your goal is to classify an input into a given set of labels. Second is unsupervised learning, where you're sort of trying to discover hidden structure, and oftentimes these networks are trained to recover their own input, but going through a bottleneck of representation. And the third is called reinforcement learning, where you have a system that interacts with an environment and gets a reward for that, such as a system that plays a breakout game or something like that, a computer game. All of these algorithms work with stochastic gradient descent. And that basically means the following. Take a sample, run it through the network, and compare it with what you expected the network to do. And then you sort of like kick a little bit against that network to make sure that next time you run the same sample through, it gets a bit closer to what you want it to be. And then you do this over millions of samples, and at the end the whole system will shake itself out and get a good model that can classify your input. The problem with this is that it's extremely expensive. So for example, a typical speech training requires 10 to the power of 18 floating point operations. An image turns out is also about the same. These are production models that we're training. So if you want to run this on a single, say, Titan X GPU, it will take more than a week to run that. And it turns out some of the systems that we had in this speech system where we beat human accuracy would take about 3 months to train on a single GPU. So very important to be efficient and be able to parallelize leverage multiple GPUs. Okay, so coming back, this was my little introduction into deep learning. And now let's go back to why we're really here. Let's talk about deep learning toolkits. So they really have to address two questions. One is how do you author neural networks? And the second is how do you execute them efficiently? But the important thing is that second part, you really should be in the business of the tool. And many of the other toolkits actually leave a lot of the things you need to do to make things efficient actually on the user side. I will talk about that later, what I mean by that. Okay, so enter CNTK. So CNTK is really, it's a library for deep neural networks, for model definition, training with scalability, efficient I/O. We try to make it very easy to author and train and use neural networks. And what's really important is we want people to think sort of on a high level. We don't really want people to think about how things are being implemented under the hood, but just think on what you want to implement. What is the formula of your network, not how you distribute things over minibatches or something like that. And we focus on having composable blocks that allow you to build complicated networks out of simple ones. The primary language is Python. The basic API is C++, so you can access it from C++. We have bindings for C# and Java is coming, but it turns out because Python is actually a very dynamic language. It allows you to do things that you can't really do in other languages. So it turns out Python is actually the nicest environment to work with. The project has been open source since 2015. It's older than TensorFlow, for example. And it came originally out of the speech research group. It was started by my colleague, Yudong Dongyu, who actually gave the talk earlier on in a different track today. It was called Computational Network Toolkit. And it has gotten a lot of contributions from Microsoft product groups and also external contributors. What's very important is, although we're Microsoft, it actually runs really well under Linux. Turns out actually the server farm that we're using to build our products and train our model is running on Linux. Whereas development typically is in Windows. So it's really first class on both platforms. Okay. Now, if you want to use this, typically what you need to do is you need to deal with three problems. You need to read your data, you need to define your network, and then you need to train your network. Now, data reading, I'm not really going to talk about that too much, but just let me tell you, it's actually a totally non-trivial problem. The problem is that this SGD process, the stochastic gradient descent process, expects the samples to be presented in random order. And random access of data that does not fit into your RAM is a big problem. And it turns out the RAM is always a little bit too small. So for example, all the speech environments, when my first work had a 20 gigabyte corpus and I had a 4 gigabyte machine. Or the 3 gigabytes was still in it. Later on, I had a 64 gigabyte machine, it was 90 gigabytes. Right? Now I have 128 and the data is 200 gigabytes. So it's always a little bit too much. So you need to really think about how you're paging data in and out of memory in a very efficient fashion, yet be able to randomize over it. And CNTK basically has a library that solves this problem for you. It's not just you load it in a piece of Python code into RAM and then run over it. It's typically not really what you need to do when you run on real production size data. Okay, so then I'm going to talk about the network predominantly. The trainer is not really that much. You simply just tell it what training parameters are, and then you run the standard output. Okay, so doing this is really as easy as 1, 2, 3, right? You define your reader, you basically create an object, you create your model, your network, and you create a trainer object. This is a trainer function here in this case, and you basically just call them, and these functions inside, they're actually really simple. Okay, so typical workflow is, well, first you prepare your data, then you configure your reader, network, learner in your Python script, and then you train it, right? Now, if you want to parallelize this, what do you need to do? It's very simple. Just say mdi exit. This is the command line to run this on, for example, 16 GPUs, where on every machine it runs, there's 4 servers here, and every server is supposed to have 4 GPUs here and runs 4 processes. It can be that simple. If you have tried to do that in some other toolkits, it's very, very difficult and complicated. This is as simple as it can be, and it should be. When you deploy it, well, first you can just deploy it in an offline fashion, run it, from file to file. You can incorporate it into your own code through the C++ API, or you can wrap it into a web service, which is typically a C# or a Java API that you will be using there, that we have for this purpose. And it's actually very performant. So this is a study, a comparison that was done maybe about 2 months ago by a university in Hong Kong, which compared a number of toolkits, and you can see maybe we're not always the fastest, but we're actually performing really well, and we're consistently performing well. So you can see like a gap from here to, for example, Torch is that much slower. What I find interesting, the TensorFlow is always a little bit slower than CNTK. So even if you use XLA, which I found very interesting, the earlier talk, you might probably get just into what CNTK does without any specific compilation techniques. And I have to pay my respect to MXNet, which is outperforming us in some cases. So how do you define neural networks in CNTK? So first you need to understand the concept of neural networks as graphs. What do I mean by that? Let's take a very simple neural network. This is similar to what I used in the very beginning. We had a couple of more people come in, so I'll explain that. This is the equation for your first layer. This is your input. You multiply it with a matrix, which, as I said, is just correlating with all the rows of the matrix. Add the bias, have the nonlinearity, and that's the output of your first layer. Now you put that into a formula that looks exactly the same thing, the same way. Get the second layer, and you put that again into a layer that just uses a different nonlinearity, and that nonlinearity computes a probability distribution. And the probability distribution over all the different classes you want to classify. It says, what's the probability that this class is what I just put in there as the x. Then at the end, you also need to have a criterion. So typically you have a label, and you compute what's called typically the cross-entropy criterion. Formula is not really that important. You're basically maximizing the probability of the correct class and over your purpose. Now, let's translate that into CNTK. Well, So it's quite easy. It just looks like Python code because it is Python code. But what CNTK does under the hood is it represents this as a syntax, as an expression tree. This doesn't look like a tree, but it really is. If you look at it, right, you could turn it into a tree structure. So it has primitive operations like sigmoid and plus. It has values that flow through, and these values are just n-dimensional tensors. They can be images or vectors. They can be sparse. And you also see a notion of composite ops. So for example, this box here is sort of a fully connected sigmoid layer. So why do we need graphs? Well, the previous talk talked about memory optimizations that you can do the moment you know the full graph. And that's actually one of the things that are really, really useful. So for example, if you want to compute the gradient, I will talk about the gradient a bit later, but it turns out you don't need to have all the intermediate values when you're computing a gradient. You can throw away some of them. And so this is a very interesting thing. You don't see anything about padding here, right? And that's exactly the thing where CNTK is different from the other tools. You don't even have to think about it. You just specify your data as being a sequence. Now we'll spend more time later on how that still works well together with minibatching. This is, I have slides on that later on during the talk.
This is actually a straight question you're trying to answer, right? Say, show flights from Burbank to St. Louis on Monday. Then you process through the toolkit, and then the deep learning figures out. I have a challenge, which is I have a set of sentences. Each sentence means a different topic based on the location, based on the speaker background, all these things.
Yeah.
Then I want to fire these sentences into this model.
Yeah.
I'm currently experimenting with this, but I couldn't find a.
So my proposal.
So my question
I suggest
is.
we take this offline after this, because
thanks.
I think this could be a longer discussion where I need to better understand what exactly you're doing. Let's talk about that. I'm by far not done, so I don't know how we want to do this. Now we're in the Q&A session already, but I think we should just.
You mentioned before that it's very easy for developers to analyze the working.
Yeah, I will talk about all of that in subsequent slides. Is that okay if I move on and then maybe ask a question at the end? Okay, so I'm a little bit afraid of losing track of the time. Okay, let's look at another example. This is an image, sort of the convnet. And what that does is it basically has this cascade of convolutional layers that are followed by a pooling layer. Then you have more convolution layers, pooling layers, and so on. And here we have an additional operator. It's called for, which allows you to write entire for loops over things. So this basically is a sequential concatenation of, in this case, 5 different types. You see it's 5 different sizes from 64 to 512, and followed by a max pooling layer. One thing I would like to point out is this, with default options. So you're actually able to define parameters that you would have to pass over and over again to those guys. And you only define them once as a default option. In this case, you really want to use the relu activation, tell to the system at every single place you do that. You just set it as a default. Same thing for padding. This is an option that either you want to pad or you don't want to pad, and typically this is consistent across your whole stack that you're working on. Okay, so let's finish this. This is the fully connected section of the network. So there's another little for loop. You can do little tricks here. For example, the dimensions go from 4096, 4096, and 2048. Well, because of Python, you can just write expressions like this and make it very easy to write this. Again, your criterion function is the same as before. In this case, you have to specify the type of being sort of an RGB image of this size. But it really looks otherwise exactly as in the previous example. So a more interesting example is translation. So sequence-to-sequence translation. So that's a little bit of an advanced topic. So one very popular approach to this is that you run an LSTM, which has been unrolled in this picture here, over the input, and whatever the last hidden state is of that LSTM is used as the first hidden state for a separate LSTM that then acts as a decoder and generates the corresponding output sequence. So how do you write this? Well, your encoder is very straightforward, sequential, and then there you have an embedding. Now here it says fold. What is fold? Fold is the same as a recurrence, but you only take the final output. If you're familiar with functional programming, you will know what that means. Well, you have seen this before. So really, you don't take the entire sequence, but it's just you get the final value out here. Now, that is what this encode function gives you. Now, for decoding, I have to write it explicitly because it's not just a linear chain. So basically, again, you define an embedding layer, in this case. So I'm not using LSTM, so I'm using gated recurrent units here, and an output projection, and this is your function. It starts with, this is called the baud vector. So you encode your input. Now you get that vector. You encode your input here, which is the history. It's always the previous word. And then you run a recurrence. In this case, it's a recurrence from an initial state, so we have a different operation for that. You run it over the group, and it takes two inputs, the thought vector, that's the start, and then R, that is actually the embedded history here. And then you project the output, and that's, sorry, this is an error, should we return R here. And that's what you're training on, right? So, okay, and just to give you an idea, so normally these networks are just a bit more complicated. So there's a plot function in CNTK, and this is actually a real example of a sequence-to-sequence model with attention model, with an attention model built in multiple layers. I'm not going to explain that in detail. This is standard plot function in CNTK. Okay, so you've seen CNTK does a decent job of being fast, and in some of the cases was the fastest of the toolkits that we looked at. So how do we do this? First thing is, well, we're obviously, like everybody, really focusing on GPUs. And what are GPUs? They're massively parallel supercomputers. Right? So each of those GPUs has, each of these little green dots here, that's a microprocessor. And what you really need to do is you need to make sure that every single microprocessor is being in use as much as possible. So you have to parallelize your data. And that's really what CNTK will have to do. It will take your network and has to turn it into a parallel program that runs very efficiently on a GPU, right? And so the main priorities here are to make sure that none of these are actually sitting idle, which is not always possible. And the second is also you have to be a little bit mindful on how much memory you move between RAM and these processors, these bottlenecks, rather than here memory controller. They're also bottlenecks in the whole process. So the critical thing you need to do here is called minibatching. So what does that mean? I told you before, you run a single sample through your network and then look at the output and kick against the system. Really, you want not to do that, but instead you take maybe 200 samples and run them in parallel through your network. Okay? And so let's say you take 256, then it turns out these matrix products you've seen, matrix times vector, turns into matrix times matrix, where the matrix is like all the columns of your data. And that is something that you can very, very efficiently compute on a GPU. Okay, so now if you have used, for example, TensorFlow or MXNet, this is not really anything new for you, right? I mean, minibatching is a completely standard technique, but the important thing is in CNTK, you don't see it. You never talk about it. You never mention minibatching except at one point where you load a minibatch and say, this is the minibatch size that I want. And everything else is always, it's out of your face. CNTK is handling all the minibatching under the hood. And that is a little bit different. So in other toolkits, you have to specify explicit batch dimensions in the tensors. It becomes very tricky when you're dealing with variable length sequences. That was your question. And but by taking it out of the hands of the user and just leaving it to the engine allows you to, eliminate and hide all the complexity that you have in this specific problem, which I'm going to talk about in one of the next slides. So why do you need to parallel? I just want to show you this chart here. So this is an example with some older GPUs. This is the minibatch size, and this is the runtime compared to some reference. And you can see the smaller your minibatch size becomes, the significant performance penalty. It goes up like 5 to 10 times or something like that. So this minibatching is absolutely critical to get performance. Okay. And it's actually not easy to get right. So in CNTK, we really try to make that fully transparent for you and just deal with it for you. Okay, this actually leads to one optimization that we're making for recurrent networks. So let's build a simple recurrent version of the network. This is what we had before. Let's make that recurrent. So the first thing we do is we introduce a time dimension. And then we add the recurrent connection. So you see now the h value here, h1, at a specific time point, depends on its own previous value. Okay, so that's a recurrent network, simplest recurrent network. What does that look like in CNTK? Well, you've already seen we have this recurrence operator, but what happens under the hood? Under the hood, under the hood we have this operator called pass value. So this is sort of a little magic operator that will create a recurrent loop, that will create a delay in your graph. So it allows you to use the previous value of this variable at this point here. And so then what we do with this is the following. So this is my graph. Let me first make a space here. And then this is the recurrent loop here, right? This is this additional operation here. And so what you see now is that there's a cyclic dependency. So what CNTK does is it analyzes the graph and discovers this cyclic dependency here. And then automatically unrolls the graph for you only for these operations here. That's actually very important to only unroll it here, because for the other operations we can still do all the batching, and it really matters for efficiency. It can make it a factor of 2 or something. Instead to run it like frame by frame from bottom to top. So we automatically unroll these cycles at execution time. And this is very, very efficient, and it's also composable because it allows you again to think in terms of higher objects. You don't need to pass around time indices all the time. Just put together boxes and blocks that handle these things under the hood for you. Now, if you, for example, compare that to TensorFlow, this is from the official example in RNNs. You have to write an explicit for loop that then actually it unfolds this in Python code over the entire sequence. That means every single word or every single step is its own little object that it creates. And that means it's very, very hard to do efficient batching. You cannot, it's hard to find back, they're all over the memory, they're not really matrices, so if you really want to make this efficient, you wouldn't write it in this way. You would have to insert manual operations where you aggregate everything, put everything in a big matrix, perform your matrix product, like this one here, and at the end spread it out again. And again, CNTK, because we do this automatic analysis here, we just do it for you. Okay, so now your question about how do we deal with variable length sequences? That's a problem. If you have, say, a lot of short and long sequences together, how do you mini-batch them? And the way that other tools approach that is, well, they form mini-batches over sequences that all have the same length. That's easy, right? That's one way of doing it. And then you can say, yeah, maybe you want to be a little bit more loose. Maybe you form mini-batches that are of about the same length. But then you have, say, mini-batches of sentences of length from 25 to 30 tokens. But now what do you do with these additional tokens? And that's where you have to introduce padding. So you have to manually pad your data and bring everything to a full length of 30. And then when you do your objective function evaluation, you really have to make sure you don't accidentally compute values from there and include that in your objective function. And then what happens if you have highly varying lengths? You will do some technique called bucketing, where you basically have multiple versions of the network that cover maybe lengths 10 to 15, 50 to 20, 20 to 25, and so on. So in CNTK, we do something completely different. So what we do is, let's say we want to pack a mini batch that start with a long sequence. Now we want to batch that together with another sequence, but we don't care whether it's long or short. So let's take a short one here. So, okay, we can put those two in parallel. What do I mean by in parallel? Well, this value depends on the previous one. This value depends on the previous one. So at that point, we cannot use like big CUDA launches. We have to unroll this. But these two here can be computed concurrently, right? That's what you would want. This is where you get efficiency from, right? And now let's imagine a very specific case. Let's imagine this single sequence. The matrix is small enough that you don't saturate your GPU. Maybe we only use half of the cores in your GPU. That's very realistic, actually, for, say, 128 by 128 matrices. You have 3,800 cores in these GPUs. You're not utilizing all of those cores at that point. So if you add a second sequence, that can be used to utilize the other half of the cores. That's great, but what do you do here? The moment you're here, you have half of your GPU sitting around doing nothing. Right? So let's say we have a third sequence. You could put it here. Right? So now you already saturated here. It doesn't really help you to have more. You're doing very efficient computation, but once you're here, now you're back to 2, and once you're here, you're not efficient anymore. So instead what we do is, why do we put it here? Right, so at that point, now you get much more efficiency all the way only at the end here. You lose a little bit. And of course, now this is a tricky bit here. You need to make sure that you don't accidentally compute the wrong thing. So let's make this batch a bit more complicated. Add more. There's another one. There's a small one that we can still fit in here. Okay. Then this is not fitting in there. So this is padding. So now we pad the rest here with don't care values. But you never see that as a user. This is just done under the hood. Now, when CNTK performs the left to right unrolling of this, here it can launch 4 operations at a time, right? It goes time step. What happens here? You really don't want to accidentally take the last state of this sequence and carry it over into this one, right? But that's just code. So CNTK just has special mechanisms to just do it right. All right, we just discover this particular case and we just make sure that at that point we just instead feed in the start value. And so that's really all, right? All you need to do is, just write the code when you unroll it, make sure about this. When you have operations that are non-recurrent, say the initial matrix product that can be applied in parallel to all of those steps, you just take this entire thing and unroll it into one huge matrix and do a single launch. Well, you even go over those padding fields. You just garbage in, garbage out, yeah? You don't really care what you compute there. And the third is you can do a reduction over this. For example, if you want to sum up the objective value over the entire mini batch, then of course you have to make sure that you don't accidentally include those padding values. So there's again special extra code that makes sure that you don't do that. But that's all built in. So this is the whole point. You don't worry about batching, and actually this gives you, it has some benefits. So for example, if you do, say you try to group sequences of the same length, you could do this by sorting your training data. But that affects your convergence. Because long sentences and short sentences have different properties. So if you proceed through your data in that way, that's giving you not a model that is as good. And this problem just simply doesn't happen here, right? Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is parallelization. So I hope this answered your question, right? That was the question you asked. Okay. So the last thing is data parallel training across multiple GPUs and multiple servers. So our approach is what we call data parallel training. So say you have 3 GPUs, you get a mini batch, and that mini batch then gets split up and computed over the 3 GPUs. And each GPU now computes a gradient only on one part of the data. And then you're facing the problem that now you have these gradients distributed over multiple machines. You need to aggregate them over all the nodes. Once you have aggregated them, you need to spread them out again to everybody, so the models can be updated, right? So this is the basic algorithm. Now, this is actually not a big problem if you're dealing with image processing, if you're dealing with convolutional operations. Because in convolutional operations, your models, your convolution kernels are relatively small compared to the number of operations you're doing. But there's a big problem when you have fully connected layers. And for example, in speech, that is something that is really, really important. And what you find if your network consists of fully connected layers, it's sort of the worst situation you can be in. So for example, one of our typical models would take 1/7 of a second to compute a mini batch on a single machine. And it would take 1/9 of a second to send the gradient to another machine. And it turns out, when you now parallelize your mini batch, say you put it onto 10 different machines, now it will go down from 1/7 to 1/17. Right? It will get much faster. But your cost for exchanging the gradients will not go down. Right? So this is your total time budget, this is your computation, this is your communication. Now the computation becomes smaller and smaller, but your communication doesn't budge. So you can't really make it faster than a factor of 2 in this particular case. That's a real observation that we have, right? Now, if you go for a convolutional network, that's very different, because in a fully connected network, every model parameter is used exactly once. If you think about it in a matrix product. In a convolutional network, every parameter is applied to every single pixel. And if that's 256 by 256, every parameter is used on 65,000 pixels. So at that point, you have data communication and you have computation that is way, 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 way more than the communication. Of course, it's very, very easy to parallelize, and it's very easy to get perfect scaling for those kind of situations. But if you're actually looking not at convolutional networks, that the previous speakers gave great examples of scalability of convolutional networks. But if you look at the other tasks that are also important, recurrences and just fully connected networks, That's no longer working at that point. So CNTK has a very unique solution for that, which is, well, okay. Let me first say, so how do you solve that problem? Well, one thing you can do is you can see, can we actually communicate less data every single time we communicate? And compress the data down. And the other is, can we communicate less often? And both are things that are implemented in CNTK. So how can we communicate less? Well, it turns out you can do one trick. You can actually quantize the gradients that you're exchanging here between the nodes down to a single bit. Sounds completely crazy, but there's a trick to it. If you quantize your values and then measure what is the error that you're making by quantizing it. So you can see, okay, what would my target actually receive this bit as? And then you subtract that from your original value and you know what your error is. You remember that error. And then when you do the next mini batch, you take that previous error and add it to the next mini batch. And then you do another 1-bit quantization and so on. And it turns out that very simple algorithm, which is sort of inspired by how you would rasterize an image when you're printing, you know, a black and white image on a newspaper or something like that. It's a similar algorithm. Turns out this doesn't really cost you any accuracy, or very, very little accurate 0.1 in some cases, but it can speed up, it can reduce your communication cost basically by a factor of 32. So now you're no longer here, you're here, right? And then you can actually work on reducing this. And so this actually allowed us to, for example, build this, you know, human parody speech recognition system that I talked about in the beginning, and brought it down from like 3 months to 2 weeks or something, which is still a lot, but at least it was feasible to build these complicated models. Okay, so the trick is basically what you transmit here is just these 1-bit versions, but you keep the residuals in the origin and the workers. Now, the other thing you can do is, well, you try to communicate less often. It turns out, this is related to the mini batch size. If you increase your mini batch size, you compute more, but you exchange less data, relatively speaking. So on the other hand, if you increase your mini batch size, you affect convergence. You cannot increase it to infinity. Of course, if you have an infinite amount, you know, infinitely large mini batch size, you can perfectly scale in whatever environment, right? So there's a limit to it. So CNTK has an algorithm that helps you to automatically determine anywhere in the training what is your maximum mini batch size that you can afford without actually hurting performance or hurting accuracy. In the beginning, it's maybe 256 in speech. Very quickly, it goes up to 5,000. At some point, you're ending up at mini batch sizes of 100,000. And at that point, the whole communication cost business is basically has disappeared. Right? So, and then there's another approach that we also implement. It's called block momentum. That technique is also, I really like that. So here the idea is that you don't really try to exchange gradients after every single mini batch. Instead, what you do is you compute maybe 500 mini batches. And then you take the aggregate update from here to here, right? All the total delta, which is sort of like a master gradient, or what you want to call it, right? And that's what you're now exchanging across machines. You aggregate it, and then you take that and add it to the starting point. Everybody had the same starting point. You add this master gradient, aggregate over all the machines to the starting point. So you can see how that really, really reduces your communication cost, but it has one problem: it doesn't work. It diverges. You will immediately fall over the cliff because you're making way too big jumps in that process. But it turns out there's another technique, it's called model averaging, that does the same thing and doesn't diverge. So what you do there is you don't actually add the full master gradient, but only a fraction of it. Typically, you average instead of summing up over the workers. And that doesn't diverge, but you can now see that every gradient that you computed only contributes a very, very small percentage of what it contributed before. There's only 1/n. So here the idea is, block momentum, you do like model averaging, you add only 1/n, but now you do the residual trick. You remember there's still n minus 1/n of that master gradient you still want to add. And put that into a residual. Then you compute the next 500 mini batches. Now you get the next master gradient. You take the previous, you know, n minus n over n of the previous gradient, add it on top of that, and then again only add 1/n. And remember that of this still n minus 1 over n, you have to put back into your residual. So the same idea sort of on a bigger scale. And it turns out that really, really works. It really works very, very well and scales better than the original 1-bit method. So we can look at this. This is a test that my colleague did on speech. So the baseline here is 11%, 11.1%, and you can see how it parallelizes here up to 64 GPUs. The error rates actually turns out they get a little bit better when you quantize. We don't quite know why. So in this case, it actually doesn't even hurt at all. And you can see in this chart that, so orange is the 1-bit method and yellow is the block momentum technique. Block momentum actually scales even a little bit better. And it scales further. So at that point, the 1-bit kind of tapers off, but the block momentum gives you the peak scaling of 54 over 64 GPUs. And again, that is the tough case. This is not the case where we use every single model parameter 65,000 times, but where we use every single model parameter once. Okay. Okay. So that's that was sort of my deep dive. Gets me to the conclusion. So CNTK's approach to the two key questions: efficient network authoring. Our approach is to view networks as function objects, which well matches sort of the nature of DNNs, right? We focus really on what you want to express and not how in terms of mini-batching and padding and packing and all of those kind of things. We just get that out of your face. And you can write it directly in the familiar syntax and flexibility of Python. You're not writing sort of the compiler backend to create variable objects and code generation and so on. If on the efficient execution side, well, we turn the graph into parallel program through this automatic mini-batching, but we do it automatically, right? That's the point here. We have the symbolic loop structure with dynamic scheduling, and we have these, I think, pretty unique parallel training algorithms that I think scale way better than some of these, like, for example, just ASGD. So what's coming next? We're looking at integration with more languages. So C# is already available for evaluation, but we're also adding all the training API, doing the bindings there. We're looking at R. People are working on a Keras backend. So you can actually write real Keras and execute it with CNTK and get all these parallelization benefits. And we do integration with systems, HDFS, Spark, and so on. On the technology side, we're still working on trying to handle models that are too big for GPUs, model parallelism. We need to do some work on if you have nested recurrent structures. We need to optimize that a bit better. And actual ASGD, I think this is already implemented, although I personally think it's not really adding too much compared to what we already have. And there's 16-bit support, ARM, and FPGA. Okay, so to conclude, CNTK, deep learning like the Microsoft product groups do it. Ease of use, focus on what, not how. Powerful library, mini-batching is automatic. It's very fast, optimized for NVIDIA GPUs and their libraries. And you have very easy and yet best-in-class multi-GPU and multi-server support. And it's very flexible through the use of Python and the C++ API. It's first class on Linux and Windows. And it's really how Microsoft product groups train. There is no difference between the internal and the external version. Every code that I checked in last night is available on GitHub. You can see that. You don't want to see it because it's not working, but you could if you wanted to. Okay, so resources, if you're interested, then please go to cntk.ai. There you, for example, can find the Python documentation. There's also the GitHub page, github.com, Microsoft CNTK, and you can also find a lot of information on the wiki. And if you're interested, to remind you, I have a bunch of stickers. They're free, so you should get one. So please feel free to come over and get a sticker for this. That concludes my talk. Thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead. So we have time for 2 minutes, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Would you like to take offline or?
I think for ours, we probably want to take this offline.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So the mini automatic batching feature is pretty nice. So the automatic batching feature is pretty nice. Can it handle more complicated cases like attention or like trees?
It can handle attention. If you want to go to, say, truly dynamic structures, at that point there's a limit. They cannot do that. Same thing as TensorFlow, for example. But there's something in between trees that this is possible.
But it does handle attention?
Yes, that's
How do you do that? Like you have a passed value on a variable to specify,
yes.
like
And then
you
we
want
look
to
at the
access.
entire input.
Like you have another thing that's like all passed values that goes
Correct.
the entire sequence.
Yeah. So in this case, so CNTK, this optimization that I talked about over for unrolling recurrences, works with one variable. If you need a second variable, in this case, is something you need, right? That you have to go back to fixed dimensions. So then you actually have to bring back padding.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. So then you basically unroll your whole input. You have to pad it up and give it a maximum length with a sort of padding flag. This is how it's implemented. And that
Okay,
works
I
very
see.
well.
Thanks.
Why 16 bits?
So 16-bit has, I think, predominantly the advantage of memory bandwidth. So if you look at, you have these gazillion cores on your GPU, but they actually have to load the matrices from GPU RAM. These GPUs are typically too large to fit into cache. So there's always the stage where it just grabs a chunk of RAM and puts that into a local cache of these cores, right? And if that is half the size, you will get a big memory bandwidth improvement. NVIDIA has native support for 16-bit floats. And I'm not 100% sure which level we're actually implementing at the moment, whether it's only 16-bit memory access or actually 16 by 16 operations. I think that can also give you maybe another factor of 2 or something like that in terms of speed, execution speed. Another question?
This is not particular to CNTK. Basically, I mean, your functional object is discriminative, right? Basically, X maps to Y.
Yeah.
So if you want to do something like, what generative, right? I want to actually model X.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I didn't talk about that. All the objective functions, the loss functions, are just expressions. So for example, the cross entropy function is literally implemented as something you could write by yourself, as a dot product, and that's how it's done. So loss functions have no special status in CNTK. They're just functions. And it turns out that's just what's at the top of your stack, and that the SGD process just uses for discriminating. So just with that, I think anything that can be expressed as a stochastic gradient descent can be implemented, and the GAN falls into that category. You do have a little bit of a challenge there because you're running 2 different kinds of data through the same network at the top. So I'm not quite sure how our current GAN, there's a GAN example that we have on the website. I don't know exactly how it does that. It might be using a specific thing that we allow you to do, which is you can actually sort of go a little lower in the level. So for example, you can, if your network consists of 3 pieces, an encoder and maybe something else here, and then the discriminator, you can just execute the forward portion of the first network, and then migrate that over into a second network, and then perform that forward. And in the other case, you would take something else and run it through a different part of the network and migrate that one over and perform forward. And you can do the same thing on the back propagation. So you can call backprop and then say, now take that gradient and plant it here and do backprop as well. This is no longer nicely encapsulated in these higher level things. At that point, you have to go a little bit lower in your stack, but it's possible. Right? That's sort of the philosophy. We try to make things possible. We try to make things easy where it's possible, but if it's not, we don't want to make sure that even things that are not easily codable, they're still possible, but you just have to go a bit lower.
This sounds particular to you. I don't think there's any other package doing this as well.
Yeah. Okay.
What I had was thoroughly confused today, right? So I'm listening to 4 different talks, 4 different toolkits, and I go, is there going to be a path of convergence going forward? I like some parts of MX, I like some parts of TensorFlow, I like some parts of yours. So will you guys work together to come up with something that's more?
This is.
So it turns out, I think the path of convergence will be on a higher level. So for example, the reason why we came up with the specific function as object mechanism is because